Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me today. This is a B2 level English listening practice, and I'm going to share with you a conversation I had recently with a colleague at work. It was one of those discussions that starts off quite casually, but ends up covering some surprisingly interesting ground. We were talking about remote work, which I know is something that affects so many people these days, and we both had quite different perspectives on it. So let me set the scene for you. It was a Thursday afternoon, and we'd just finished a team meeting that had run a bit longer than expected. Most people had already logged off, but my colleague and I stayed online for a few minutes, just chatting. The meeting had been about productivity and how the company was reviewing its remote work policy, which is what sparked our conversation in the first place. I mentioned that I'd been working from home for almost 3 years now, and honestly, I couldn't imagine going back to the office full-time. For me, the benefits are just too significant to ignore. I don't have to spend 2 hours commuting every day, which means I have more time for myself, more time to exercise, and I can actually cook proper meals instead of grabbing something quick during a lunch break. Plus, I feel like I'm more productive at home because I can control my environment. There are fewer distractions, no colleagues stopping by my desk every 10 minutes, and I can focus on deep work without interruption. But my colleagues saw things quite differently. They pointed out that while working from home does offer flexibility, it can also be quite isolating. They told me they'd started to feel disconnected from the team, almost like they were working in a bubble. They missed the spontaneous conversations that happen in an office. Those moments when you overhear something interesting, or when someone suggests grabbing a coffee, and you end up brainstorming ideas together. According to them, those informal interactions are actually really valuable, even if they don't seem productive at the time. I hadn't really thought about it that way before, so I admitted that they had a point. However, I also mentioned that technology has made it easier to stay connected. We have video calls, instant messaging, and collaborative tools that allow us to work together in real time. I said that while it's true that remote work requires more intentional communication, it doesn't necessarily mean we have to be isolated. It's just a different way of interacting, and in some ways it's actually more efficient, because meetings tend to be shorter and more focused when they're online. They agreed with that to some extent, but then they brought up another concern. They felt that when you're working from home, it's much harder to switch off at the end of the day. The boundaries between work and personal life become blurred, and before you know it, you're answering emails at 10 o'clock at night or working on weekends because your laptop is always right there. They said they'd experienced this themselves and found it quite stressful. In the office, once you leave, you leave. But at home, work is always present, and that can take a toll on your mental health. I could definitely relate to that. I told them that I'd struggled with the same issue when I first started working remotely. It took me a while to establish proper boundaries and create a routine that worked for me. Now I make sure to have a dedicated workspace, and I try to stick to regular hours as much as possible. I also make a point of closing my laptop and putting it away at the end of the day, which helps me mentally disconnect. But I acknowledged that it does require discipline, and not everyone finds it easy. On the other hand, my colleague raised another interesting point. They said that for people who live in small apartments or shared accommodation, working from home can be really challenging. Not everyone has the luxury of a separate office or even a quiet corner where they can work without interruption. They mentioned a friend of theirs who'd been working from their bedroom for months and had found it incredibly difficult to concentrate, especially with housemates moving around and making noise. In those situations, going to an office can actually be a relief because it provides a proper working environment. I had to agree that was a fair observation. I'm fortunate enough to have a spare room that I've turned into an office, but I realize that's not the case for everyone. I suggested that perhaps a hybrid model might be the best solution, where people have the option to work from home or come into the office depending on their circumstances and preferences. That way, those who thrive in a remote environment can continue doing so, while those who need or prefer an office setting can have that option as well. They seemed to like that idea, but they also wondered whether companies would genuinely offer flexibility, or whether they'd end up pressuring people to come in more often than necessary. They had heard stories of organizations claiming to support remote work, but then subtly penalizing employees who didn't show up in person, for example, by overlooking them for promotions or excluding them from important discussions. They felt that for hybrid work to be truly effective, there needs to be a culture of trust and respect, and managers need to be trained to assess performance based on results rather than physical presence. I completely agreed with that. I said that one of the biggest challenges with remote work isn't the technology or the logistics, it's the mindset. Some managers still have this outdated belief that if they can't see you sitting at your desk, you must not be working. But that's simply not true. In fact, studies have shown that remote workers are often more productive than their office-based counterparts because they have fewer interruptions and can structure their day in a way that suits them best. The key is to focus on outcomes rather than hours spent in front of a computer. My colleague nodded and mentioned that they had read something similar recently. However, they also brought up the issue of career development. They were concerned that working remotely might limit opportunities for learning and growth, particularly for younger employees who are just starting out. In an office, you can observe more experienced colleagues, ask questions on the spot, and pick up skills informally just by being around people who know what they're doing. When you're working from home, that kind of learning doesn't happen as naturally, and it might put some people at a disadvantage. That was a perspective I hadn't fully considered before, and I admitted it was a valid concern. I suggested that companies could address this by being more intentional about mentorship and professional development. For example, they could set up regular one-on-one sessions, create virtual workshops, or encourage team members to share knowledge through online platforms. It might require more effort and planning than the informal learning that happens in an office, but it's definitely possible if the organization is committed to it. We also discussed the environmental aspect of remote work, which is something I feel quite strongly about. I pointed out that fewer people commuting means less traffic, lower carbon emissions, and a smaller environmental footprint overall. For me, that's a significant benefit that doesn't get talked about enough. My colleague agreed that it was an important consideration, although they mentioned that it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. For instance, people working from home use more electricity for heating, cooling, and powering their devices, and in some cases, that might offset the environmental benefits of not commuting. Still, they acknowledged that, overall, remote work probably does have a positive impact on the environment. Another thing we talked about was the effect on local businesses. My colleague brought up the fact that when people work from home, they're not spending money on lunch at nearby cafes, they're not buying coffee on their way to the office, and they're not using local shops and services during the week. This has had a real impact on businesses in city centers, and in some areas, it's led to closures and job losses. They felt that while remote work might be convenient for employees, it's important to think about the broader economic implications as well. I hadn't really thought about it from that angle, and I admitted it was a fair point. However, I also mentioned that remote work has created opportunities in other areas. People are now spending money in their local neighborhoods instead of in business districts, which can help support small businesses closer to where they live. There's also been a rise in demand for co-working spaces, home office furniture, and digital tools, which has created new markets and employment opportunities. So while there are certainly economic challenges, there are also new possibilities emerging as a result of this shift. As our conversation went on, we both agreed that there's no perfect solution that works for everyone. Remote work has clear advantages, such as flexibility, time savings, and reduced environmental impact. But it also comes with challenges like isolation, blurred boundaries, and potential impacts on career development and local economies. The key is to find a balance that takes into account individual needs, company culture, and the nature of the work itself. Towards the end of our chat, my colleague said something that really stuck with me. They said that ultimately what matters most is having the freedom to choose. Some people genuinely love working from home and would never want to go back to a traditional office, while others prefer the structure, social interaction, and separation that an office provides. Rather than forcing everyone into one model or the other, organizations should trust their employees to make the decision that works best for them, and then provide the support and resources needed to make it successful. I couldn't have agreed more. I think that's the direction things are moving in, slowly but surely. Companies are beginning to realize that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work anymore, and that flexibility and trust are essential for attracting and retaining talented people. Of course, it's not always easy to implement, and there are still plenty of organizations that are resistant to change. But I'm hopeful that over time, we'll see more workplaces embracing a flexible approach that benefits everyone involved. So that was our conversation. It was one of those discussions that makes you see things from a different perspective and reminds you that there are always multiple sides to every issue. I came away from it with a deeper appreciation for the complexities of remote work and a renewed belief that open, honest conversations like this one are incredibly valuable. Thank you so much for listening today. I really hope you found this useful and that it gave you a chance to practice your B2 level English listening skills. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future videos. I'd also really appreciate it if you could give this video a like and share it with anyone else who might benefit from listening practice at this level. There's plenty more content like this available, and I'll be uploading new listening exercises regularly, so stay tuned. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.